The studio was cold, not from air conditioning, but from tension. Global leaders sat in a perfect circle on the round table stage. Lights burned above. Flags of 50 nations surrounded them. Cameras rolled. The world was watching. Captain Ibrahim. Traoré adjusted his uniform quietly. His eyes scanned the room, not with fear, but with calm fire. He wasn't here for applause. He was here for truth. Across from him, Vance from the U.S. sat stiffly in his chair. His papers were neat, his face unreadable. The moderator smiled politely, but her voice trembled. "Let's begin," she said. "African sovereignty and Western policy." The first few speakers talked. Words like aid, stability, and development echoed around the room. Something about them felt hollow, empty. When it was Captain Trout's turn, he paused just long enough to make people lean in. Then he looked straight ahead, not at the camera, not at the host, but right at Vance. And in a voice that was soft, clear, and almost fatherly, he said, "What the world calls help has kept us in chains." There was a sudden silence. JD blinked. The moderator froze and millions of people at home leaned closer to their screens. Something had just shifted. Vance had prepared for this moment. His team had given him briefings, reports, talking points. None of them warned him about the way Traoré would speak. Not loud, not angry, but like a man who'd seen too much and stayed quiet for too long. "I was born during a time when Burkina Faso had 7 foreign bases on our soil," Traoré continued. "Each promised peace, none delivered it." The audience listened. "No African child dreams of war," he said. "But we bury our children in silence while the world debates our future from faraway boardrooms." Vance shifted slightly. Just a flicker, barely noticeable except the camera caught it. A long blink, a sigh. His jaw tightened. He hadn't expected to feel anything, but there was something raw in Traoré's words. Not political, not rehearsed. Just real. Traoré didn't stop. "We're told we must qualify for aid," he said softly. "But our gold qualifies without question. Our uranium qualifies. Before the ink dries." A gasp in the audience. JD looked down for a second. Not to write, just to breathe. And then his eyes met Traoré. For a brief electric second, there was no senator, no captain, just 2 men. One speaking, one listening. The clip wasn't meant to go viral. It was just a 13-second moment. Quiet camera panned from Captain Traoré to Vance. No words, just expression. The internet didn't miss it. JD eyes, the slow blink, the twitch in his jaw, the stillness of his hands. It was the look of a man realizing something, maybe too late. Someone tweeted, "Did y'all see Vance's face when Traoré said that? That's the look of a man who just got hit by the truth." 1 million views in 1 hour? In the studio, JD tried to stay composed. But there was something different now. Traoré wasn't attacking. He wasn't blaming. He was inviting the world to stop pretending. "I do not hate the West," Traoré sagently. "I hate being told I should thank it for my own silence." People in the audience stared wide-eyed. A woman from Senegal covered her mouth. A man from France lowered his head. Even the moderator wiped her eyes. And Vance, for once he had nothing to say, just that same quiet face stuck between discomfort and respect. Inside the broadcast control room, producers were panicking. Zoom in on JD's face again. No wider shot. Hit the audience too, barked one. But something strange was happening. The audience wasn't moving. No coughing, no shifting, just stillness. Captain Traoré had said just 23 words. Yet the air felt different now. Thicker, heavier. Vance leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. His brows were drawn, not in anger, but confusion. Traoré had called out the hypocrisy so gently it felt like poetry. When aid comes with strings, it's not a gift, it's a leash. Someone in the crowd gasped. That sentence alone would trend for days. JD swallowed hard. He had worked years to understand policy. But in that moment, he realized this wasn't about policy. It was about pain. Generations of it. One African diplomat quietly wiped his eyes. No one was shouting, no drama, just stillness and truth. Back in Ohio, JD's press team saw the footage. One aide whispered, "He's not supposed to talk like that." But it was too late. Millions had already heard it. And for many, including JD, something inside had started to shift. 2:11 a.m., a small TV flickered in a dusty home in Ouagadougou. A boy named Lame sat cross-legged, ice-wide. He was just 11. He didn't understand every English word, but he didn't need to. He understood Trey. He saw a man who looked like his uncle. His brother, his teacher, standing tall, not begging, not smiling to please, but speaking with power. "Papa, come," he shouted. "He's on." His father came from the next room, wiping his hands on a cloth. They both stared. JD Vance's reaction was playing again on replay. The blink, the pause, the slow, heavy breath. "They feel what we say doesn't matter," Traoré had said. "But if we don't speak, we disappear." Lame clutched his shirt tight.
Is he in?
"Trouble for saying that?" he asked. His father didn't answer. But deep down, that silence said everything. Around the world, people who'd never even heard of Burkina Faso before were suddenly asking, "Who is this man?" And a small boy sitting on a mat with cracked feet and hungry eyes whispered something that wasn't just a wish. It was a prophecy. "One day I want to speak like him, too." The hotel room was quiet, too quiet. JD Vance sat alone, still in his suit, shoes off, staring at a pause screen of the round table replay. It was Traoré's face. Mid-sentence, eyes calm, shoulders relaxed, but every word had landed like a thunderclap. JD rewound the clip again. Again, he wasn't offended. He wasn't angry. He was shaken. He'd spent years studying African economies, aid flows, and development models. He thought he understood it. But Traoré wasn't talking about numbers. He was talking about dignity. JD picked up his phone, opened Twitter, and hesitated. The top trend. Traoré tells the truth. Millions were watching, crying, debating. He clicked on one video. A Ghanaian woman in tears said, "For once, someone said it without fear." Another post, "I feel seen, feel heard. Thank you, Captain Traoré." JD turned off the phone and rubbed his temples. Something about this night wouldn't let him sleep. Not because he felt attacked, but because for the first time in a long time, he felt small. And maybe, just maybe, that's where change begins. Paris, Accra, Johannesburg, Atlanta, Lagos, Nairobi. It wasn't even sunrise yet. But the video had already hit 12 million views. A single clip, 13 seconds long, had gone viral. Not because of what was said, but because of how JD Vance looked as he heard it. "They want to fix our wounds," Traoré had said, "but they are the ones who keep reopening them." The camera had caught JD blinking hard, pressing his lips together, swallowing. The silence had screamed louder than a speech. In Kenya, a university, student whispered to her roommate. He didn't expect Traoré to be this brave. In a DCBAR, an older veteran turned up the TV. That African captain just shut the room down without raising his voice, he said. And in Burkina Faso, a school teacher wiped a tear as she watched the replay for the 5th time. "I've waited my whole life," she whispered, "to hear someone say that." By morning, news headlines from every major outlet carried the same phrase. A quiet earthquake, Traoré's words, Vance's reaction, and the shift we all felt. But the real tremor wasn't in politics. It was in people's hearts. JD Vance sat in front of his laptop, hands trembling. He had drafted a message to Traoré, just a private note, nothing official. But now he stared at the blinking cursor. "Captain, I don't agree with everything you said, but I can't stop thinking about how you said it. I've been in politics for years, but last night I felt like a student again." He stopped typing. Was he really going to send this? Across the hall, his aide knocked. "CNN want you live in 10. What's the message?" JD looked down. He hadn't slept. His tie was still off. He couldn't even think clearly. The clip kept replaying in his head. Traoré hadn't raised his voice, but somehow it had felt like the entire world got quiet just to hear him. JD deleted the email, then typed it again. "You made me feel something I didn't expect. Not shame, not guilt, just truth." He hit save, not send. He wasn't ready. The truth was something had broken open inside him. And for the first time in years, J.D. Vance didn't feel like a senator. I felt like a man searching for what he'd loathed. In the official replay room backstage, the summit's media director was reviewing footage for archival. When he paused at the 13-second clip, a young assistant beside him leaned in. "That's the shot," she whispered. "What shot?" "The one that broke the world." The media director looked at the screen again. J.D. Vance leaning back slightly, lips parted, eyebrows folded, not in anger, but in recognition. And on the opposite side of the frame, Captain Traoré standing tall, calm, focused. "We're not asking for pity," Traoré had said in that moment. "We're asking for the world to stop pretending we need saving." It was the kind of statement that didn't slap you right away. It crept into your soul, and there it stayed. In the VIP lounge upstairs, a European ambassador sat alone with a glass of wine. She watched the clip on her phone again and again. Then quietly she set the phone down and cried. Not because of guilt, but because for the first time in her long diplomatic career, someone from Africa had spoken it with anger, not with shame, but with unshakable dignity. And dignity has a way of making power feel small. Few people knew her name, but she shaped him. Rama Traoré, Ibrahim's mother, once sold tomatoes under the sun with cracked hands and a head full of hope. She never learned to read, but she taught her son something far greater. Never confuse silence with weakness, she told him. Sometimes silence is a storm waiting to be heard. When Ibrahim was 9, he saw her cry after a man in uniform yelled. At her forceling too close to the road, she didn't yell back, just picked up her basket and walked away. That night, he asked her, "Why didn't you say something?" She looked at him and whispered, "Because one day you will." Now on the screen of every major global news network, he was doing exactly that. As J.D. Vance watched from his hotel suite, he wondered what made this man so different. Traoré wasn't just political, it was generational. Somewhere Marama, now old, her back bent but her eyes still fierce, sat in her modest courtyard and quietly wept. "He remembered," she said. Softly, he spoke for all of us. J.D. Vance had spent the entire morning avoiding the press. His aides begged him to make a statement, say something neutral. Praise the dialogue. Defend your position. But his heart wasn't in it. Then his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, hesitated, answered. "Hello." A pause, then a warm, quiet. "Voice Vance? This is Captain Trout." J.D. sat up straight. I didn't expect to hear from you." "I know," Trey replied gently. "But sometimes the silence between two men says too much." J.D. let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "You shook the world," J.D. said quietly. "I didn't mean to," Trey replied. "I only meant to tell the truth." "Dare?" was another silence. But this one felt different. Not heavy, not awkward, real. Trey continued. "I didn't speak to accuse you. I spoke to remember those who've been forgotten." J.D. rubbed his face. "I think you reminded me of something I stopped seeing. I spoke for only 6 minutes, but it was the kind of conversation that doesn't need an audience. Because some revolutions begin quietly between two men who finally decide to listen." Maria Bell was watching from Geneva. She had spent 8 years working in West Africa, delivering food, organizing clinics, filling reports. She believed in her mission, until today. She watched Traoré's words again, his tone soft, his gaze unwavering. When the help becomes a habit, and the habit becomes a leash, are we still being helped, or just managed? She dropped her fork, her hands trembled. Her husband walked in and found her staring at the screen, tears running down her cheeks. "I thought I was saving people," she whispered. "But maybe I was silencing them instead." She remembered the boy in Burkina Faso who had asked her once, "Do you ever let us fix things ourselves?" She hadn't known how to answer, but now Ibrahim Traoré had answered it for her in front of the whole world. She opened her old travel journal filled with notes, maps, and names of the children she'd met. And for the first time, she didn't feel proud. She felt humbled. "I wasn't the hero," she whispered. They were. It was a story Ibrahim Traoré had never told until now. He was 12, A missionary group had visited his village in a white truck, passing out water, powdered milk, and worn-out books in English and French. Ibrahim grabbed one, a world history for children. The cover was torn, pages were missing, but his eyes lit up. That night, under a flickering kerosene lamp, he flipped through it eagerly. But the deeper he read, the colder his heart became. Africa was barely there. One paragraph, 3 sentences. As if the entire continent had never lived, never breathed, never dreamed. That night he cried, not because he was angry, but because he realized the world had decided who mattered and who didn't. Now, decades later, standing in front of diplomats and senators, he said calmly, "We've been erased softly through silence, but I promise you we are not invisible." J.D. Vance, watching in real time, suddenly thought of his own Appalachian roots, how his people had also been called backward, poor, forgotten. He looked down at the table, wasn't sure if Traoré had just spoken for Africa or for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. J.D. Vance stood quietly in a hallway backstage. After the second summit session, no cameras, no handlers, just him and a voice behind him. "I didn't think you'd stay." J.D. turned. It was Traoré alone, no entourage, no security. "I needed to," J.D. said. "What? You sat earlier?" It shook something loose. Traoré nodded slowly. "Truths do." J.D. hesitated. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Where did you learn to speak like that? It's not just the words, but the calm, the strength." Traoré looked him in the eye and said, "From silence, from watching, from losing." J.D. didn't speak. He just listened. "I've seen mothers give birth with no clinics. Villages lose their wells and still share their last cup of water with strangers. These people don't scream, J.D. They survive. They carry the continent on their backs." Something inside J.D. cracked. It wasn't political. It was human. And for the first time, the senator who once doubted Traoré's presence at the summit reached out and shook his hand. No words, just respect. And somewhere deep down, an old wall began to fall. In a village just outside Wahiga, Burkina Faso, a little girl named Mira sat under a mango tree. She had no shoes. Her dress was faded, but her eyes were bright. She watched the global summit on a small battery-powered TV her uncle had rigged from old parts. The screen flickered, but the sound was clear. Traoré was speaking, and Mira leaned in, as if the words were meant just for her. "You don't have to speak loudly to be powerful," he said. Mira whispered the sentence aloud. She didn't know why, but it made her chest feel warm. Her tiny fingers traced the dirt beside her. That night, she asked her mother, "Can people from small places change big things?" Her mother paused, then smiled. "Yes, especially people from small places." In New York, a black father watched the same speech with his teenage son and said, "See that man? That's what leadership looks like." In Oslo, a refugee family huddled around an iPad nodding silently. And in that moment, across time zones and oceans, a continent rose, and the world finally listened. The summit had ended. The world was still buzzing. News channels replayed the clip of J.D. Vance's stunned reaction again and again. Memes, hashtags, heated panels. But far from the noise, in a quiet hotel suite in Geneva, Traoré received a phone call. It wasn't from a fellow African leader. It was from a senator's office in Ohio. J.D. Vance had requested a private follow-up meeting. No press, no staff, just 2 men, Traoré agreed. When they met, J.D. didn't open with politics. He opened with this. "My grandfather was a coal miner. No one listened to him either." He paused. "But I heard you, and I need to understand more." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Traoré reached into his bag and pulled out something small. It was the torn children's book from his past. Jay turned it over slowly. "This," Traoré said, "is why I speak." The senator stared at the book. His eyes glistened. No cameras, no speeches, just 2 human stories colliding. While 3 weeks later, A hand-delivered envelope arrived at J.D. Vance's D.C. office. No name on the front, just one word, Mercy. Inside was a letter written in French, then translated underneath in careful handwriting. It was from Amira, the barefoot girl under the mango tree. She had seen the summit. She had watched J.D. listen. Thank you for not laughing. Thank you for not walking away. Thank you for not calling him a liar. She wrote about her dream to be a teacher, to write books where Africa wasn't forgotten. I want to write my own pages now. I think maybe the world is changing. J.D. folded the letter, eyes wet. Something had shifted. That night, in a Senate subcommittee, he shocked everyone. He spoke not about defense or budgets, but about dignity, about stories, forgotten people, small villages, and yes, about Traoré. Across the ocean, the little girl's letter sat on his desk. It had no seal, but it carried more weight than any government stamp. And across Africa, people felt it. Something had begun. 6 months later, a new children's book was quietly published in both French and English. Its title, The Boy Who Spoke Softly. The boy in the story had dark skin, a steady gaze. He lived in a village surrounded by dust and silence, but inside him was fire. He asked questions no one had dared to ask. He stood in rooms where he wasn't expected, and narrow-minded the world. Being small does not mean being weak. The author, Amira, she was 12. In the final page, a drawing showed a little girl standing next to a man in a uniform. Above them, the stars of 2 continents shone together. Underneath it read, "Inspired by Captain Ibrahim Traoré." The book went viral and people began asking, what if this really was the beginning? What if the story of Africa wasn't over? What if this time we listened? This is not just a story, it's a mirror. If this touched your heart, made you cry, or gave you hope for a better world, don't scroll past. Like if you believe voices like Ibrahim Traoré matter, comment, we hear you. If you think it's time the world listened to Africa, subscribe so you never miss powerful stories that change hearts and spark conversations. And most importantly, share this video. Let the world hear what silence is hidden for 2.